Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you are safe and doing very well. I am Dr. Alok Sharma, the organizer and moderator of this webinar. Law Center 1, Faculty of Law, under the guidance and mentorship of our professor in charge, Professor Sirabjit Kaur, has been celebrating glorious 50 years of Law Center 1. In the light of the same, we have been running a webinar series on various aspects of law with the support of our PIC and other faculty members. In continuation to our webinar lecture series, we are delighted to have on board Mr. Raj Shekhar Rao, Advocate, Supreme Court of India today. Mr. Raj Shekhar Rao is a prominent and one of the topmost lawyers practicing in the areas of NCLET, company law, the insolvency and bankruptcy code, etc. He is also an eloquent speaker. Mr. Rao graduated from NLU Bangalore in 1999 and began practicing as an advocate before the Honorable Supreme Court of India in the chambers of present Honorable Justice Maz Indu Malhotra. Mr. Rao subsequently joined the chambers of Mr. Gopal Subramaniam, a senior advocate for 5 years, during which time he assisted Mr. Subramaniam as a junior counsel in matters such as the Helka Commission case, as well as the Parliament attack case before the Delhi High Court and the Honorable Supreme Court of India. Mr. Rao started his individual practice in 2006. Mr. Rao's principal area of practice are civil commercial litigation and arbitration. He has also been engaged by Directorate of Enforcement as a special counsel in regard of money laundering cases and as a legal consultant to the Justice Sri Krishna Commission on Financial Sector Law Reforms constituted by the Government of India. With a very warm heart, I would like to welcome Mr. Raj Shekhar Rao for a brief discussion and conversation on the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Sir, heartiest welcome on behalf of our professor in charge, on behalf of the faculty members of Law Center 1, on my personal behalf, and on behalf of the students. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. At the outset, thank you for bearing with me and my recalcitrance all these days and for having me over. The more I do this, the more I realize how unfair we've been to our teachers and our professors through our lives, because it is very easy, according to me, to prepare for a brief, which you're given today and to argue tomorrow. But to prepare for a webinar, it has taken me a really, really long time, and it's very, very tough. So, and I wouldn't have been able to do it without the help of Mr. Dawar, who's, in the other video as Mr. Raj Shekhar Rao. He's a former colleague of mine, and even today, steps up to help me whenever I need some help. So thank you, Samir. The reason I titled this, talk called Conversations about on the IBC is because, really speaking, the IBC is such a vast area that it's impossible to try and teach or, kind of cover all aspects of it. I thought I'd take it down to the very, very basics, since I'm really talking to law students. And perhaps share my experience on how one dealt with a new statute that came into the field, about 4 years ago. And the advantage of the IBC was that suddenly for everybody, it was a level playing field. So even if you were a lawyer with a big practice and, were a regular in the company law board or the NCLT, this statute was as even, kind of gave everybody an even plane, and which is why you see a whole bunch of youngsters doing some fabulous work in the area. I thought the easiest way, and especially in a webinar, to kind of hold attention, I'll use my version of the Blackboard, which is something that I am getting used to, a presentation, which again, like I said, I've had Samir help me on. I'm just wondering if I can share that on the screen and then start with that straight away. So, insolvency, as the name suggests, refers to the inability to discharge one's debts. It's as simple as that. Solvent is one who has money. Insolvent is essentially one who's run out of money. And historically, so one thing that I've always learned, I've learned from my seniors, is when you get into a new statute or into a new subject, always dive deep into the history of it. It's a great learning in terms of how the law has evolved It tells you what is it that the lawmakers sought to deal with. Was there any mischief that they sought to avoid? And more importantly, what was really the underlying philosophy in enacting certain aspects of the legislation? So, jumping straight to historical background, you'll notice that we really had no bankruptcy law till the IBC of 2016. There is, if you look at, there's some brilliant reading in the 64th Law Commission on insolvency proceedings, where there is reference to insolvency legislation, going back to the early 1800s. A lot of it, of course, is borrowed from the British statutes, etc., and effectively only dealt with personal insolvency, really did not deal with corporate insolvency. And if you had a problem with a corporation that was insolvent, the only remedy was to go and seek winding up. So you'll see at the turn of the century, we have two principal legislations that were enacted to deal with insolvency. Again, dealing only with individual insolvencies and specifically excluding corporate insolvencies. The Presidency Towns Insolvency Act and the Provincial Insolvency Act. The only difference, perhaps, apart from some difference in structure and procedure, was that, as the name suggests, the Presidency Towns Insolvency Act applied to the Presidency Towns, whereas the Provincial Insolvency Act applied to the provincial towns. But the same problem remained. Corporations were out of the loop. Historically, I'll just run through this quickly. We've had a whole series of attempts over the last decade to try and find some way to improve the efficiencies of the credit recovery system and to ensure that a fair balance was met between the need of a creditor to recover his debts and of a debtor to be protected because of the fact that the debtor runs an industry. Now, that's that critical balance that law tries to achieve. Law seeks to encourage industrialization. The object of industrialization is that it creates opportunities for employment, etc., and generates revenue, which in turn enriches the state. The flip side, of course, is if a promoter goes, and becomes a defaulter, the lending agents suffer, again has an impact on the state. So it's a critical balance of the economy at both ends of the spectrum. So as you see from the screen in front of you, the Law Commission made certain recommendations to the Provincial Insolvency Act in 1964. Then there, you had no real movement on the ground, and one then went saw the enactment of the Sikh Industrial Companies Act in '85. Now, the SICA again, if some of you are familiar, I'm not sure you are. It's been repealed for a while now, and really has not really operated for a considerable amount of time, given the fact that the BIFER was really a defunct agency by the time we all started practice. Nothing really moved. The SICA was again trying to set out a procedure where corporations which had, in a sense, lost the ability to be financially self-sustaining and had, in a sense, had losses in excess of their net worth for over a period of 3 years, were deemed to effectively be wound down. And there was a procedure prescribed. So you had to go to the BIFER, you could go voluntarily, people could take you to the BIFER, etc. And this process, unfortunately, was beset with several delays, including, of course, that huge gap between what the legislature wanted to implement and what actually happened on the ground. And promoters, of course, had every trick in the book to try and delay proceedings. Now, there's some very, very interesting reading in the Goswami Committee report in 1993, which, and I shared that last evening with my juniors in office. Let me see if I can just pull that one quote out. And the reason I say it's relevant is because what they said in 1993 is as relevant even today. So this is what the Goswami Committee's first page inside says in a box. There are sick companies, sick banks, ailing financial institutions, and unpaid workers. But there are hardly any sick promoters. There lies the heart of the matter. Now, if you look at the number of scams that have happened in the recent past, the number of extradition proceedings that are taking place to bring back, big daddy promoters from abroad, nothing seems to have changed on the ground. You've had law after law after law being enacted. So in that sequence of events, before leading up to the bankruptcy code, you have the Narasimhan Committee report. And please remember, 1991 is when the Indian economy opened up. There was a thrust, at trying to resolve, to bring forth certain changes to the Indian structure, particularly the legal system. And you have a whole series of reports, each of which has either influenced the ultimate law that came into place or has tried to bring to bear certain aspects to new legislations, which kind of moved things in a step in that direction. So post the 1991 Narsimhan Committee report, you have the Debt Recovery Act being implemented. That's been somewhat helpful, but again, I think given the numbers and the manner in which our systems function, that's also got bogged down. You eventually then had Narsimhan Committee Report 2, which brought to light the SARFAESI Act in 2002, and now we're about 18 years from there. Then you had the Eradi Committee Report in 1999, which kind of proposed a comprehensive overhaul. But frankly speaking, and as a student, it's a matter of great pride for me, because Dr. N.L. Mitra was somebody who taught us when I was in college. And he really was part of the RBI committee in 2001, which proposed a comprehensive bankruptcy code. You have a series of other procedures there, but I think it comes to fruition in 2013. And again, I had the privilege of being one of the legal consultants to assist Justice Sri Krishna on the FSLRC, which is the Committee on Financial Sector Legislative Reforms, which, as you note, we examined all this history and recommended that in fact you need a resolution corporation. The object of that resolution corporation was to take a company which was really being recalcitrant, pick up all of it, put it into one place, and try and either resolve or dissolve. And that was the object of the entire process that was recommended in the FSLRC. This led to the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee set up by the Department of Economic Affairs, and based on the two reports that they submitted, the interim and the final, the IBC was enacted. Of course, the IBC was enacted, the object was there. It's been far from perfect. There have been amendments, and over the years, I think there have been steps taken by government to try and bring it more in tune with what the ground realities were. We'll see some of them as we go along. Now, one of the most important things when you look at a legislation is to understand the whys and wherefores of that legislation. Like I said, so historical evolution is one, and then of course you look at really the statement of objects and reasons, which gives you a great insight into really what the statute intended. Now, this is what the statement of objects and reasons of the IBC says. No single law in India that deals with insolvency and bankruptcy. Provisions relating to insolvency and bankruptcy for companies can be found in the SICA, like I mentioned, the DRT Act, securitization. So this is that historical evolution. And please read note the last sentence. The existing framework for insolvency and bankruptcy is inadequate, ineffective, and results in undue delays in resolution. Therefore, the proposed legislation. So therefore, the object of this entire process was to bring forth a new law which compressed the timeline for resolution of distressed corporations, found the ability to maximize value, and to dissipate that in a hierarchical order, which of course we call as the waterfall. The preamble on those lines suggests that it is an act to consolidate and amend, and we all understand that consolidation and amending acts essentially take the existing law and then put it together. And to relating to reorganization and insolvency, resolution of corporate persons, etc. But please note the highlighted portion: in a time-bound manner for maximization of value of assets of such persons, to promote entrepreneurship, availability of credit, and balance the interests of all stakeholders. Now, again, that critical balance of trying to find either you think that you can resolve and bring it back to business, which means you need to infuse credit. If you have to infuse credit, there have to be certain parameters within which that will operate, all of that. And at the same time, also balancing the interests of workmen, etc., etc. The scheme, again, something that I was taught early on in the profession. If you'll just give me 1 minute, I'm so sorry. I have somebody who's repeatedly calling me. When you look at a new statute, to just go straight to the index and spend as much time as you can there. The advantage of that is it tells you what the structure of the statute is. A lot of legislative intent as to how it intends the law to operate is also evident from that structure. Number two, it gives you the manner in which the statute has been set out, and perhaps at times gives you insight into how to use a particular portion of the statute or not, just in terms of just looking at the broad headings. So I'm going to focus on very few aspects of the IBC. Like I said, this is like a comprehensive course otherwise. It's divided into 5 parts. Each part, of course, has subparts, but part one is the one that applies across the board, which is really the short title application and definitions. And most definitions, as again you all are aware, are subject to context. So the same word can have two different meanings in the same statute depending upon the context in which it is used. And the definitional clause may not necessarily always be the definition that the statute wanted to apply in a particular situation. Then, of course, part two is really what I will focus on, because that seems to be what's really the most relevant, that is in the present day terms, which is the insolvency resolution and liquidation for corporate persons. So the entire CIRP process is set out in part two. Part three is resolution for individuals and partnership firms, etc. Part four is again the structural infrastructure that's been set out by the statute in terms of insolvency, professional agencies, and information utilities, etc. And then part five is miscellaneous, which has, amongst other things, one of the most important sections, which is the impact of the IBC and the overriding clause, and what is the interplay between the IBC and current statutes which are existing. How have they been amended? Have they been amended at all, etc. Strangely, again, I don't know why this happens from time to time. This is something that as a lawyer, one keeps grappling with. It's easy to enact law, bring the entire law into operation on day one and let things be. No, but our legislature and more importantly, the government, loves to complicate things. So this is just a screenshot of the first set of footnotes in the IBC statute. And you will see that the statute has come up, has been notified at various times. Various portions of the statute have been notified at various times. And as a litigating lawyer, it can be a nightmare, because you keep fearing that you will walk into a courtroom one day and pick up a section which has not been notified and you've not caught on. And frankly, I must concede, even I don't think I've got that delicate balance between what has been notified and, more importantly, what's not been notified till today. But it's important when you look at the IBC to therefore make sure that anything that you're relying on, and a substantial chunk of the statute is now operational and has been dealt with in some detail for some time. But to make sure that the section that you are looking at has been notified, and if yes, when, because that again has a bearing on how things operate. And you'll see that the Supreme Court has had to deal with the issues of what is the effect of a notification of a particular provision on a particular date? What is the effect of a notification or an amendment on a particular date? Does it apply prospectively? Does it apply retrospectively, etc.? So in that context, let's go straight into the act. Now, the statute, as I said, a large chunk of your learning is just by reading the statute. Section 2 is your standard section in terms of application, and who all does it apply to. So section 2 says it applies to corporate persons, including statutory corporations, LLPs, personal guarantors to corporate debtors. There is a judgment of the Supreme Court that deals with this, because there was an amendment during the course of the implementation of the IBC, and the question was whether it applied prospectively or otherwise. And of course, the question of to what extent are personal guarantors tied down by the IBC process. Now, this is really the critical part, because there are, again, it's one of those strange statutes which has two definitional clauses. So there is a section 3 of definitions and there is a section 5 of definitions. And each one says subject to the context, unless the context otherwise stipulates. Some very, very important ones which I've culled out. I've obviously, as you can see, I've not looked at everything. But board is obviously the IBBI, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board. Claim, reasonably self-explanatory. Creditor, again self-explanatory. Debt, explanatory so far as it is considered here, but when you get into financial debt and operational debt, obviously things change. 312 deals with default. 319 is an insolvency professional. Now, this is, of course, a completely new set of people who've been carved out under the IBC and whose existence is owed to the IBC, who are supposed to be certified to be able to handle matters set out in the IBC, and more importantly, have duties and obligations which are extremely, extremely relevant in the entire resolution process, because they really act as the interplay between the applicant, the committee of creditors, and are in a sense tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that the IBC process works in the most efficient and optimal manner, if I were to use the words. Now, other expressions, for instance, security interest, etc. Now, part 2, like I said, according to me, this is, at least as things stand, the most the fulcrum of the IBC and the most critical component of the statute as far as the IBC is concerned. Now, it started on a very strange situation. So please look at section 4 for a minute, which I put out there. Section 4 stipulated that the minimum amount of default is 1 lakh rupees. Now, I don't know what the legislature was thinking at the time when it enacted it, because frankly speaking, in today's day and age, when we are looking to be, you know, a 5 trillion economy in the next 5 years or so, a sum of rupees 1 lakh is trifling. It is not even a penny, or a, you know, or even probably 0.0001 of a penny in those terms. But the legislature in its wisdom believed that that was enough to trigger the application of the IBC. And please remember, again, the old, you know, the debate insofar as winding up was concerned, that winding up was intended to remove operations that were unable to discharge liabilities. And that entire winding up process under 433 of the erstwhile Act was intended not to be a recovery mechanism, but in reality, it effectively became another means of recovery, where you sent a notice of winding up to somebody who was being difficult and not paying your debts. And chances are that he saw that notice of winding up, didn't want to go to the High Court, and therefore ended up either paying or settling, or then got stuck in a long process where a provisional liquidator was appointed till some settlement was arrived at. And the time and cost that would entail in this process was substantial. So in that backdrop, it's surprising that the legislature chose a 1 lakh limit, because the cost of prosecuting a 1 lakh default by a company which probably had the funds and chose not to pay was probably a lot more. So that balance, again, from an economic perspective, perhaps was not thought through very carefully. One explanation that one could obviously perhaps read into this entire situation is that the legislature had carved out that distinction between a financial debt and an operational debt. And the idea was to impose certain stringent rules insofar as financial debts are concerned, and insofar as operational debts are concerned, there was enough play in the joints in the statute, which allowed parties to kind of avoid the rigors of the IBC. Now, to give effect to this process, and just one small caveat, that 1 lakh amount has now, on 24th of March 2020, by a notification and exercise of Section 4, powers under Section 4, been enhanced to 1 crore. So at least a little more realistic, and it keeps, in my respectful submission, the riffraff out of the IBC framework and allows the adjudicating authority to focus on things that matter. There is, of course, again, an element of doubt as to whether, and please note, this happens literally the day after the lockdown is announced. So the government has noticed that there is going to be pressure otherwise, and this is really in the sense of a stopgap arrangement. Subsequently, you know that the IBC process has also, for all practical purposes, been put on hold for a year's time. This is the flexibility in the statute where government has been given powers. But at the end of the day, has the statute thought it through? Perhaps there are gaps still which need to be covered. In order to aid this process, the idea was to set up a specialized authority which would deal exclusively with the insolvency process. And that was intended to achieve two purposes. One was to encourage specialization, and B, to ensure that that agency was not bogged down by any other work. So it was a dedicated agency specializing in the field, which would over a period of time generate its own experience from handling various, and that would lead to clarity in the law, which in turn would guide human behavior. Again, huge gap between concept and reality. The adjudicating authority is essentially given to, okay, the NCLT is made the adjudicating authority. The NCLT is already handling the Companies Act, therefore multiple jurisdictions in a sense. And in that process, in my view, some of the objects of the statute get diluted straight away, because you're obviously giving it to a body which is in a sense already burdened, and you're adding extra burden without the ability. Of course, the government has taken several steps over the last year, particularly to increase the number of benches, to add to the number of members, etc., etc. But one still feels that it would be useful to have it in a designated authority which does only IBC and nothing more. The counterfactual is that because the adjudicating authority also deals, which is the NCLT, also deals, of course, wearing a different hat, with other subjects like the Companies Act, and as a consequence, other statutes. The cross-pollination of experiences from various statutes would assist in dealing with insolvency cases. Now, dispute is defined under Section 5.6. I'm not going to labor that. 5.7, and there's a lot more in the statute eventually, but two expressions that are critical to the operation and central to the IBC are financial creditor and operational creditor. Then, of course, you have the committee of creditors. So really speaking, three expressions which permeate the entire statute. So a financial creditor is a person to whom a financial debt is owed and includes a person to whom such debt has been legally assigned or transferred. Now, in the ordinary course, even an operational debt is a financial debt because at the end of the day, it's a claim for money. But the distinction, of course, is in the nature of, in the manner in which that debt is created. So the statute in section 5.8 essentially says a financial debt is a debt that is given with interest as one of the components and therefore the time value of money. So it says means a debt along with interest, if any, which is disbursed against consideration for the time value of money. Now, the interesting thing is it uses the expression debt along with interest, if any, and then says disbursed against consideration for time value of money. Now, I was faced with the situation where somebody gave a friendly loan and wanted it back. And since there was no payment, we went to the NCLT, which is the adjudicating authority, and made a claim. The adjudicating authority took the view, said this is an interest-free loan. So where is the time value of money? Therefore, in a sense, read into this entire scheme of things, the fact that it had to be with interest, which would only be, which would define the fact that it was against time consideration for time value of money. One, of course, argued that I gave somebody 100 rupees today with the understanding that the person will return 100 rupees 3 months later. The manner in which the markets work and how money works is, especially with depreciation and inflation, is that 100 rupees today perhaps is worth 99 rupees 3 months later. So in a sense, even if I've given a friendly loan with no interest, the time value of money is he benefits getting a rupee extra at the end of 3 months. He saves a rupee, whereas I lose. And we tried to make that argument. The NCLT didn't buy it. The Supreme Court, of course, eventually seems to have concurred with the fact that you don't need to have this whole thing of interest as long as there is some evidence to demonstrate that there is time value. And the intent is really one of, in the sense of lending. So you'll notice that the definition of a financial debt is very, very wide. It says debt along with interest, if any, disbursed against consideration, and includes, it's an inclusive definition, and a series of things. So money borrowed against payment of interest, that's a simple, straightforward thing. Amount raised by acceptance under any acceptance credit facility or its dematerialized equivalent. Please see D, amount of any liability in respect of a lease or hire purchase which is deemed finance, because again, there you are servicing something. Receivables sold or discounted other than any receivables sold on non-recourse basis. So this again, I thought if one could link it to the fact that there is no interest, somebody has a claim, he's assigned that claim to me at a discounted rate, and therefore one of us has made money on that transaction. Any amount raised under any other transaction, including a forward sale, etc., having the commercial effect of a borrowing. So at the end of the day, the intention was that somebody had to lend money, somebody had to borrow money. There is an explanation which, in a sense, explains this a little more. This was, of course, the home buyers amendment, which ultimately gets looked at by the Honorable Supreme Court and Pioneer. And again, there is this huge debate on whether a home buyer should be a financial creditor or an operational creditor. Inter alia, amongst for reasons that a financial creditor at least has some hope of recovering money in the waterfall. An operational creditor 9 times out of 10 in a sick entity is likely to be at the bottom of the waterfall and will virtually probably get nothing. So there is this huge tussle, to be at the top of the rung or as close to the top of the rung as possible because of that hierarchy. Now, this is the insolvency resolution process period. 514 says the entire process should be completed within 180 days. Interestingly, now, again, looking at how legislature approaches legislation and the entire legislative process, the statute in 514 says 180 days. Section 12, which gives the adjudicating authority the ability to enhance time, and it said 180 plus another 90 days, so 270 days, now has an amendment by introducing 2 provisos to 12.3, which effectively makes the maximum period 330 days. Now, in that process, they don't amend 514. So 514 remains 180, 12.3 seems to suggest 330. And it's not very clear as to, where is that power coming from? So, I mean, again, this is just in terms of pointing out that approaches to legislative lawmaking is less said the better. They don't cover they don't tick all the boxes. 520 is an operational creditor. Like I said, this is one of the two central expressions the statute uses and applies to. This is a person to whom an operational debt is owed and includes any person to whom such debt has been legally assigned or transferred. So the idea, of course, you've noticed that the last phrase is common in both. The idea is that it's a debt. It's essentially in the nature of an actionable claim that should be able to be, capable of being transferred, and I should be able to monetize this, whereas my rights should be capable of vesting in somebody else who can pursue remedies in accordance with law. Operational debt is a claim in respect, and now this is where it becomes interesting, and that's the difference between what otherwise would be a financial claim becoming an operational debt vis-a-vis a financial claim, financial debt under the statute. A claim in respect of the provision of goods or services, including the employment or a debt, including employment, or a debt in respect of payment of dues arising out of under any law for the timing in force, payable to the central government, so and so. So it's either for goods and services, or it is a claim for dues to a statutory authority or a government authority. Personal guarantor, I don't think I need to really clarify that. Resolution applicant is a person who submits a resolution plan. This is a person who's interested in kind of bringing the company back, to some sense of working. You'll all be somewhat familiar with the fact that initially it was understood that promoters could participate, at least could offer, till it was seen that promoters were coming back to take over their own companies through the back door by taking huge haircuts. That led to the enactment of Section 29A, and to kind of keep persons acting in concert out unless they cleared all debts. So it made it a deterrent and also ensured that only genuine people participated. Resolution plan, and most importantly, to avoid misuse of that entire process. The resolution plan, of course, is the plan basis which the committee of creditors takes a view on whether or not it's a viable enterprise and whether they should vote on it and go ahead, or whether they should decide to liquidate. One of the things that the Goswami Committee notes in 1993, and again, it's actually quite simple. The general understanding is if you sell something as a going concern, you probably make 60 to 70% of its worth. If you break it down into its constituent parts wisely and then sell each of those parts, you probably maximize the value that the company otherwise has. So that's the critical call for the Committee of Creditors, and that's what the resolution plan suggests on what is the way forward, what is the outstanding liability, is there a possibility of a haircut, is it a viable enterprise, does it have the ability to generate profits in the future subject to good practices being put in place and infusion of funds. All of these are factors that come into place. And please remember, at the end of the day, and it's now clarified by the Supreme Court, that a substantial chunk of the assessment under the IBC is commercial, it's not legal. And the adjudicating authority, to a large extent, in fact, performs a quasi-judicial function rather than a stricto sensu judicial function. So the Committee of Creditors, it's those people who have their money stuck in this enterprise because they are the ones who are owed money. They are the ones tasked with the responsibility of deciding whether it's in their interest to revive the company, or it's in their interest to essentially just kill the company, sell off its assets and find some way to recover whatever is due, even if it's a fraction of what was owed to them, rather than having a company which is unviable, inefficient, and perhaps has a dishonest promoter on board, continuing to operate and defrauding the public at large. So a resolution professional, like I said, another key component of the statute. Now, part two is persons who may initiate. So the foundational basis for initiating any CIRP process is default. So therefore, either operational or financial. Section 7 sets out the procedure for initiation of a corporate insolvency resolution process by a financial creditor. I'm not going to read it. This is something that I'm sure students will be able to look at in their own time. The idea is to just run through the statute, give you a sense of it, and then try and at least comment on some of the laws, that has emanated from the Supreme Court over the last 3-4 years, particularly the last 2-3 years. You'll be surprised. Again, a large chunk of that is dedicated to one judge, Justice R.F. Nariman, and one of the brightest judges one of our smartest senior counsel, one of the brightest minds that the Indian legal system has seen, and somebody who I think who just took to it like a fish to water. So his judgments are so erudite, and this whole historical basis that I mentioned, a large chunk of it is evident from his first 2 decisions in Mobilox and Innoventive. Innoventive being the first one, and Mobilox, where he keeps going back to the underlying philosophy that laid the foundation for enactment of the IBC, and more importantly, the historical wrongs that the IBC sought to remedy. So that approach, in a sense, gives a considerable amount of clarity as to why the act is structured the way it is, and why some of the judgments delivered by the Supreme Court interpret the law in a particular manner, despite the fact that perhaps there's an alternative interpretation available. So 8 is with regard to operational creditors. Now, what you will notice, and that's the only difference that I wanted to point out, Section 7 says a financial creditor may file an application for initiating CIRP when a default has occurred. And he has to essentially satisfy the adjudicating authority that a default has occurred. So he has to put forth evidence of such default. When it comes to an operational creditor, it says may, on occurrence of a default, deliver a demand notice. So first he has to deliver a demand notice. Then within 10 days of receipt of the demand notice, and that's the corporate debtor. So that's the opportunity. And like I said, that perhaps was what weighed with the legislature when it put that 1 lakh stipulation as a threshold. Because for operational creditors, it understood that, and that's what the Supreme Court also looks at and kind of comments on, that operational creditors are day-to-day transactions, or these are periodic interactions between two sets of parties. At times I'm a vendor, so there may be an issue with some of my goods. The company to whom I'm supplying may actually have a genuine reason to not pay me. Whereas in terms of financial debts, it's clearly, it's my money, I lent it to you, you're supposed to pay it back to me within a time frame or on certain agreed terms, and you've defaulted. Here it is a question of services. There are other factors that bring to bear and may complicate the ability of a third party to assess who's right, who's wrong. And if that assessment is required to be made, then perhaps the correct forum is not really the IBC process, it's the regular civil court or whatever else. So the corporate debtor is given an opportunity to, within a period of 10 days of receipt of a demand notice or a copy of the invoice, to bring to the notice of the operational creditor, and please note the expression, the existence of a dispute, and dispute is a defined term, if any, or record of the pendency of the suit or arbitration proceedings filed before receipt of such notice. Now, the critical yardstick being that the dispute has to have arisen prior in time to the demand having been made. We've seen several instances where the minute you receive a notice, in reply, for the first time you say, no, but your goods were defective. Now, I've been supplying goods to you for the last 3 years. Limitation period is 3 years. You've not paid me for 2 years and 11 months. In the 11th month, I send you to the second year and 11th month, I send you a notice of demand. And for the first time, after having consumed the goods, you turn around and say, I'm sorry, I'm not good. I have not paid you for 3 years because your goods were deficient, or that you did not do this, you did not adhere to the terms of a contract. Now, akin to the moonshine defense, again in winding up, which the Supreme Court, again, incidentally, Justice Nariman looks at the old Mechalek line. Mechalek was, the Calcutta High Court decision, which was repeatedly relied upon by various decisions in Hubtown. And he sets out the parameters as to determine when as to how a summary suit has to be dealt with, whether a defense is a real defense, whether it is moonshine. If it's got some merit, then should there be conditional leave, unconditional leave? So in a sense, the same principles apply. So as long as a operational creditor is able to demonstrate that the defense taken by the person who owes money is moonshine, or essentially is something that's been taken subsequently in time and was not taken prior in time, chances are that the adjudicating authority, the IBC process will not come into play. So, really, this is only goes to demonstrate that you have to therefore be consistent in your dealing. If there's a problem, flag it the minute the problem arises, so that tomorrow you're not accused of bringing up something as an afterthought only to avoid a claim for payment. Now, there are certain sections which I've just set down for convenience because they add to the scheme of things, but I'm not going to elaborate on them as of now, given paucity of time. But 11 says persons who are not entitled to make an application. So there is a carve out. And that's an important thing. You'll read that with 29A. That's another instance where the statute says you will not participate. So you're not going to be permitted to bring forth. Please also remember that the advantage with this statute is the fact that it also allows a corporate entity to go in for voluntary winding up. So, corporate insolvency, corporate resolution. Now 12 is again time frame. Like I said, 514 has 180 days. 12 seems to have now, in a sense, by the amendment, increased it to 330 days. So that little gap, but really speaking, the Supreme Court has eventually, in Arcelor and other judgments, held that the timeline stipulated in the IBC are sacrosanct. And really speaking, if you can't resolve a company within a period of close to a year now, then frankly, there's no point wasting any more time. You should just then go to liquidate and figure out that process. That's the balance in terms of, yes, if we can revive it. And because these are commercial decisions, if it can be revived, it will get revived on the, within a short period of time. Somebody will be willing to make money off that transaction. Otherwise, absolutely not. Now, can be withdrawn, etc., etc. 12A, some amount of case law on this has a bearing on who's entitled, who has the final say. Again, it's the committee of creditors. The vote share is stipulated. This comes in by way of an amendment. Now, moratorium. Now, this is really one of the most critical provisions under the statute, because it is like a safe harbor to the company undergoing the resolution process to effectively get some time to run its affairs without the pressure of creditors bearing down. So once the adjudicating authority decides that a company needs to be put into insolvency and admits the application for insolvency, either at the instance of an operational creditor or financial creditor, or at the behest of the company itself, there is a period of time set out in the statute, which is a moratorium, which, if you notice the section, for prohibiting all of the following, namely the institution of suits or continuation of pending suits or proceedings against the corporate debtor, including execution of any judgment, decree, etc., etc. So you insulate the enterprise. Now, the question therefore was, okay, I can't claim monies against the enterprise. Now the company says, but I am owed monies by third parties. If you are looking to maximize the value of my assets, these receivables are things that are available with me, which are available with third parties. Should I be permitted to go after? There was some gray area there. The NCLAT has now clarified the position and has, in a sense, struck a balance where it says, you will continue with proceedings where the company is to recover money, whereas the other party should not be entitled to pursue its claims. And there are some instances, if I'm not wrong, where they've said arbitral proceedings can continue, but an award should not be made if it pertains to an award against the company in insolvency. But if it is in favor of the company, then of course, by all means, let an award come, because it is to claim money. So it adds value to the company's assets. There are some exceptions there in the statute. I'm not going to spend some time there. Like I said, the resolution professional is an important hub in this whole thing. In the first instance, he is the interim resolution professional and subsequently substituted by the resolution professional. The statute carves out duties and sets out certain rights and obligations that these individuals have to do. Now, in the interim, like I said, that moratorium, notwithstanding the fact that the petition has been admitted, the understanding is that the company has to operate as a going concern. The only difference is, while the management may still be in harness, it is the IRP who steps in and effectively becomes the key point, who is responsible for the affairs of the company, and all decisions are to be taken at least with his consent. In practice, what the IRP usually does is really preserves, regulates financial control and leaves the running of the day-to-day operations to the enterprise, because frankly, it's not really within the realm of the IRP's expertise beyond the point. Having said that, the question then arises, isn't the ex-management responsible for the current state of affairs of the company? Why would you allow them to continue running the affairs of the company? But again, this is a limited time frame. It's a stopgap arrangement till the resolution plan is either approved or not. And therefore, the law feels there's no reason to have somebody else run it as it is. But please note, the interim resolution professional has the authority to appoint such professionals as may be necessary to assist him in his functioning. And of course, he has the ability to act in the interim. So for all practical purposes, management is superseded and is reserved in the hands of the IRP. So the legislature allows the company to continue working. Now the COC, section 21, is the committee of creditors. These are the people to whom monies are owed. They come together, sit in a room. Their rights inter se are determined with reference to how much debt each is owed, and that has a bearing on their voting share in that meeting. But they come together, and they are the ones who ultimately are what should I say, have the right, duty, and authority to decide what the fate of the company is. So somebody may come up with a perfectly good plan, and the committee of creditors may turn around and say, "I'm sorry, not interested." And because that's a commercial call, the level of scrutiny by the adjudicating authority and consequently by the appellate authority is limited. It's not that it is not without limits. It is not beyond scrutiny, but it's a very, very narrow window. And that's what the Supreme Court also seems to suggest in Arcelor, essentially saying primacy of the committee of creditors. It's a financial call. Don't interfere unless absolutely perverse or illegal. Now, there is some amount of discretion there. Obviously, one expects that discretion to be used wisely. These are the duties of the resolution professional. 29A, I mentioned, ArcelorMittal, in fact, deals with this in some detail. Essentially, the object of this amendment was to prevent promoters from coming in through the back door to take over enterprises which they've been removed from, and and to avoid getting a haircut on debts that they otherwise owed. So this is the object underlying that is here. When I come to ArcelorMittal and a small comment on that, I'll demonstrate that. So the legislature took some time, and this is again part of the learning of the last couple of years of the IBC's operation from 16 onwards, to bring to bear what these were loopholes that were sought to be exploited, which are slowly sought to be plugged in by the law. This is really speaking the final, nail in the coffin, as it were, or the final green flag. Either the resolution plan is approved or it is not approved, and that is set out in section 31. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The rest of the statute, like I said, insofar as this chapter is concerned, part 2 is concerned, has the logical sequitur in case there is no resolution, then liquidation, and chapter 3 deals with liquidation. Chapter 4 is a fast track insolvency, self-explanatory. 5 is voluntary liquidation, which is where a company feels that it wants to go under because it wants to declare bankruptcy. Adjudicating authority for corporate persons is really speaking the NCLT today, because that's been conferred powers, and offenses and penalties. Now, I wanted to flag 2 particular sections in chapter 6, which again demonstrate legislative intent and also, in a sense, lay the foundation for what happens if you abuse the process. So 60 is the standard ouster of jurisdiction clause. It's very clear. It says no civil court shall have jurisdiction in respect of any matters that the adjudicating authority or the appellate authority will have the powers to exercise under the statute. 65 is interesting, and I'll just read 65 for a moment. It basically says, if any person initiates the insolvency resolution process or liquidation proceedings fraudulently or with malicious intent for any purpose other than for resolution of insolvency or liquidation, as the case may be, the adjudicating authority may impose upon such a person a penalty which shall not be less than ₹1 lakh but may extend to 1 crore rupees. So this fascination with 1 lakh and 1 crore you see in various places in the statute. Bottom line is, it's meant to be a deterrent. And again, to go back to the winding up experience, that the entire process was converted from one where a company was genuinely unable to pay its debts and therefore should have been struck off, to one where somebody who's owed money uses this additional, weapon in the armory of lawyers to try and recover monies. Part of it is to embarrass. So a company is coming out of the public issue. You send a notice of winding up under SEBI rules and regulations. A disclosure is required to be made. That disclosure has a bearing on the financial health of the company, etc., and all of which then creates problems on the ground. So the idea of this entire exercise was to only encourage genuine applicants. And now, with the threshold being increased, I think that would also make it a lot more stringent. I personally believe that even a 1 crore amount is still too low. If you want, the object of the insolvency law is to essentially take care of businesses that have an impact on the economy. And we don't want a large corporation, something that is akin, not obviously not akin to too big to fail, but large enough to impact a significant section of the population, to continue to remain an enterprise which is running when it is in fact really, in dire straits. Now, in that backdrop, to say 1 crore is a limit is perhaps too less. It has to be the target has to be the big enterprises, and it should perhaps, according to me, be at least in the range of 5+ crores, perhaps 10 crores. Claims in respect of 1 crore, etc. Please remember, now you have jurisdiction of the trial courts that has gone up. The Commercial Courts Act has been implemented. There is enough in the Commercial Courts Act to try and expedite and fast track. So there is already this race between the Arbitration Act and the Commercial Courts Act to see which of these two avenues provides a better remedy for an individual. And lawyers today, where there was a trend to move to arbitration straight away. Now you realize that fine, arbitration sounds nice, but you get an award and the grounds of challenge are so limited that you don't want to give up your rights of appeal. So do you want to take the chance before a commercial court, and therefore would you want to avoid an arbitration clause completely? So in the same vein, I feel that the mathematics underlying the IBC needs to be relooked at, but I guess the process is reasonably on track. And like I said, subject of course to some more modifications, we should be able to have a reasonably watertight process in place. The gap, of course, again, is no matter how great the statute, it is how it is implemented that ultimately determines how well it operates and whether it meets its objects. So far, we've had a good run, and I can only see getting better. The challenge, of course, is the vast explosion of litigation, part of which will be taken away by the dilution of that, by the enhancement of jurisdiction. But again, like I said, it's important to have dedicated tribunals dealing only with a certain number of cases to set the record straight, and the rest, in a sense, follows automatically from ordinary day-to-day commerce. Now, coming to some important decisions, and again, I'm covering a few of the most important ones are Innoventive and Mobilox, because in a sense, they are the first two decisions that come out of the Supreme Court on the IBC. Innoventive deals with a financial creditor. Mobilox deals with an operational debt. And each of them sets out the parameters as to what would a court do and how should a financial creditor be, how should a financial debt be dealt with under the IBC as also Mobilox. And what is the nature and scope of the inquiry? Now, my beef with both these decisions, at least, I mean, it's not so much with the decisions, but the manner in which they've been interpreted, it almost seems to suggest that the nature of the inquiry that the adjudicating authority has to do is very, very narrow. I feel that there is enough in the language of Innoventive in particular, as also Mobilox, to suggest that the inquiry has to be meaningful and rational. So it's not just, is there a debt? Is there a default? Is it as crystal, or can the authority go a little deeper into that to prevent what was the object of Section 65, vexatious and fraudulent or malicious claims being brought to bear? But the law as it is practiced today seems to suggest financial debt, default, nothing more, go straight into the bin and go into the IRP process. Mobilox, there is a dispute. The minute there is a dispute and the dispute has been raised prior to receipt of the notice, you have it's like a get out of jail free card. So that kind of a situation. So it's a green pass. This whole question in Ramakrishnan, of course, was the question of whether the code applies to personal guarantors and of a corporate debtor. And there was an amendment. So the question was whether it would apply or not. The Supreme Court ultimately looks at the Insolvency Law Committee report and holds that the amendment to 14, in which the moratorium was prescribed, would not apply to guarantors. Now, why? Because contractually, they're two separate contracts. Of course, it's a tripartite agreement, but they're two separate contracts in that sense and independent of each other because it's joint and several liability. And the underlying philosophy was, if I have entered into a contract and have company A and I have a personal guarantee of the promoter, there is no reason for me to wait for the IBC process to go through, because ultimately the act is focused on ensuring that a creditor receives his money. So the personal guarantor doesn't get the benefit of the IBC process, which was what was sought to be argued. And because of that gray area, the amendment comes into place and therefore does not apply. Today, it does not apply to personal guarantors. Similarly, we have Arcelor, which deals with the Section 29A, and the challenge was, what is the expression and amplitude of persons acting in concert? And the Supreme Court, like I said, adopts a purposive interpretation of Section 29A. And I'm just quoting, and in fact, some of it is an extract from the Supreme Court decision itself. Depending both on the text and the context in which the provision was enacted, the Supreme Court holds that any person who wishes to manage, control, or be a promoter of a corporate debtor classified as a non-performing asset must first pay off the debt of the said corporate debtor classified as a. So essentially, put your money where your mouth is, and then demonstrate your bona fides before we allow you to even be a part of the table. Then, of course, the question was, when does this ineligibility apply? So they said it's actually at the time when the resolution plan is submitted by the resolution applicant. So enough time for you to get your affairs in order. And again, quoting from the Goswami Committee report, 1993, and that's why I said that thing keeps striking back, because it's interesting that the problems that one saw in 1993 continue to remain in 2020 and are seen by the statute in 2019 and are adjudicated by the Supreme Court in 2019. That ingenuity of promoters, knows no bounds. So therefore, timelines were sacrosanct. Supreme Court spends a lot of time defining the role of the resolution professional and more importantly, the powers of the adjudicating authority and the appellate authority. And then, like I said, it says you have the ability to intervene, but the parameters are narrow. They're defined under the statute and you really can't stray beyond that. And wherever possible, defer to the commercial wisdom of the Committee of Creditors, because ultimately it's their money, not yours, and it's their interest. Now, Pioneer, of course, is where the challenge to the home buyers as financial creditors amendment was sought to be challenged. The Supreme Court upholds the constitutional validity of the introduction of home buyers as financial creditors. Like I said, there is a wealth of discussion on this, and this is something that's been criticized to a large extent, because in a sense, it places a premium on what social justice. And this was something that plagued the SICA and those statutes. The emphasis there was, we will keep the company alive as far as possible to keep it going. Why? Because if the company shuts down, workers will suffer. So with the intent of ensuring the provision of employment to a section of the population, you allowed an inefficient economic entity to continue to operate, which, if you look at the ultimate economic analysis, probably did more harm to those workers than good. So it's that same logic. Home buyers, again, the problem with this whole exercise is you could be a speculative investor who's put in 10% in every project. You've defaulted, but bottom line is, if the enterprise, if the builder and the has failed to deliver, you in a sense become a financial creditor, and you stand at at a higher rung of the waterfall than somebody who may actually have an adjudicated decree in his or her favor. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to make this very quick. It looks at the history of the code, etc., and again sets out the differences between an operational creditor, etc. Now, Parag Gupta raises another very interesting question. The NCLAT Justice Mukhopadhyay took the view, and consistently, that the Limitation Act did not apply to proceedings, because he said this is a new statute. It talks about an application under Section 5. You could have never filed an application under Section 7 or 8, under Section 9, for instance, as an operational creditor, till the IBC came into place. So I'm not concerned with Limitation Act. So even if you had a time-barred debt, because the law on time-barred debts is essentially that they are time-barred to the extent that you don't have the ability to recover them, but in a sense, you can adjust them, set off, etc. Again, of course, subject to a small caveat on one could argue that even set off, it has to be a live claim, etc. And then, of course, there is Section 25 of the Contract Act. The Supreme Court evaluates Section 238A and ultimately says that there's no purpose in allowing time-barred or retrospective claims to be resurrected through the IBC process, and concludes accordingly. K. Shashidhar, again, the question was, what is that percentage? Again, largely stipulating that the commercial wisdom of the Committee of Creditors really is to be given weightage. The earlier stipulation was 75%, was diluted after June of 2018 to 66%, all of which only was to fast track the entire resolution process. And like I said, the scope of inquiry, if you see para 2, and the grounds on which the decision or approval of the resolution plan by COC can be interfered with by the adjudicating authority is set out in the code. And really speaking, it is, the Supreme Court says, err on the side of caution by looking at what the adjudicating authority says, and rather than stepping in and trying to read this as an appeal. Then Anuj Jain, for instance, Axis Bank, what is a financial debt, what is, and who's a financial creditor. So this is really the lay of the land insofar as the IBC is concerned. Like I said, I've laid my primary emphasis on part 2 because that's really what is practically applicable as of now, at least. Personal insolvencies, etc., nothing really on the ground. and the fact that the object of the legislature is evident from the enactment of an overriding jurisdiction clause. So section 238, if I'm not wrong, which seems to suggest that the IBC is really overrides any prior legislation. So 238 says, yes, the provisions of this code shall have effect notwithstanding anything inconsistent therewith contained in any other law for the timing enforced, or any instrument having effect by virtue of such law. 238A, like I mentioned, was introduced by way of an amendment to clarify the positional limitation. And of course, then there are several statutes which have been amended by the IBC, which find place in the schedule. Bottom line is this: the IBC answers a long pending need of society, and particularly the commercial sectors in society, of having a framework to ensure that only such corporations who follow good practices and have their business affairs in order to continue operation, and to, by the deterrent prescribed by the IBC, promote good practices. Notwithstanding that, we are familiar with the fact that there are times when, despite your best efforts and doing everything by the book, your business may not succeed and you will fail. If that happens, then again, while nobody imputes motives, another reason why then you should not be allowed to continue operating the business and harming other people. You should be then dealt with in accordance with law. If somebody believes that they can add value to your ecosystem by removing you and stepping in, by all means, let him or her bring a resolution plan and have the committee of creditors operationalize that, failing which your assets get stripped and sold. So that's really the delicate balance between trying to ensure that the economic efficiency of enterprises is maintained, and at the same time providing for a reasonably transparent resolution process where the lagam, as it were, is in the hands of the money lender. So, and the court being, in a sense, the parents patria who sits slightly above and supervises the process. So it's like a light touch regulator, really speaking, and not so much a judicial entity in that sense. And the commercial wisdom of the COC is paramount. With that, I think I've probably given you a very, very broad bird's eye view of the IBC. I am happy to take some questions. I realize that it's 5:35, so I don't know. I'll leave it to ma'am. And otherwise, I mean, if somebody wants to have any chat with me offline, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to get into that discussion. I think I've learned a lot just by reading up again on this. So this process only it makes it richer for me. So please feel free.
Now I request students to kindly ask their questions also. Advocate Rao, we have 2 questions presently, and I request more students to ask more questions. So Parvez Ahmad is asking, sir, what is the process of application of corporate insolvency resolution?
So that, see, there are 2. Again, the forms under the IBC prescribe the procedure. If you are a financial creditor and you have a financial debt which is unpaid and there is a default, you will then follow the Section 7 process. You will file an application demonstrating that, with evidence demonstrating that there is a default, and that in the ordinary course sufficient. If you're doing a Section 9 process where there is an operational creditor, you will have to first give a notice to the other party indicating default. The other party has 10 days or so to respond to your notice, in which they have the ability to flag any disputes that may have be the reason for non-payment, etc. Now, so that's the fundamental distinction, and the process is quite simple. The forms are in the statute. It's quite crystal in terms of what you need to do, what you need to give. Like I said, proof of default is sufficient in one. So you have to demonstrate that you gave money. Obviously, you have to ensure that it is a financial debt within the meaning of the definition. Because like I said, the problem that I faced in one of those cases where a friendly loan was treated not to be a financial debt. So you'll have to obviously crystallize that and put forth evidence. Whereas as an operational creditor, you might have to obviously demonstrate that you've delivered services. Interestingly, so when you're applying as an operational creditor, it's always useful to place material which demonstrates that they were satisfied with your services. It's important to make the averment that they've never really disputed the quality of your services or the quality of the goods delivered by you. On the contrary, they've used it. There are instances you will see, and this is something that one sees regularly, where you've supplied goods to a company and the company says, oh, we will pay you in a few weeks. You write back after a few, they say, yes, management is examining your matter, but nowhere are you told that there's a problem. Whereas if at the delivery slip itself, somebody says goods received, but bottles appear broken and therefore subject to verification. Now, assume you've delivered on the 1st of April and 6 months later, you write to them 4 times saying, please tell me if there's any other problem, and nobody writes back. Could you then argue there is a dispute? Is there a genuine dispute? These are factors that an adjudicating authority takes into account. So it's important to buttress an operational creditor's claim as one which is clear, which is uncontroverted, and if you're lucky, you may not get a response to your legal notice, or if you're lucky, the legal notice, the reply to the legal notice may not really contain anything substantive, and therefore a court, the adjudicating authority may still take the view that there is an admission of debt and admit the matter.
Right. Another question is from Chetan Goyal. He's asking what I actually wanted to ask. So he's asking, sir, can you please suggest how a fresh law graduate or a young lawyer could start a career in the field of IBC?
Okay, so I think, okay, very simple in that sense. Find somebody who goes to the NCLT regularly. Okay, so there are many career options, right? One is, of course, you practice in the NCLT and the NCLAT, etc., the adjudicating authority, appellate authority. So you work with a lawyer, you learn the ropes, and then you go and start your own thing. The other is you might want to just become a resolution professional, and there's a whole bunch of people who, particularly chartered accountants, who are now qualifying as resolution professionals and are, strictly just doing that. So, and now how do you go about that business? The easiest way is to pick up judgments delivered by the NCLT in particular and read. You will find some names appearing more often than the others. I would pick up the ones that you keep finding regularly and reach out to them and say, can I work with you? Do an internship. Intern with not one, intern with 5-6 people who practice IBC. Now, you'll also find in practice that times, Mr. X may be briefed in every matter in the IBC, but if you work with Mr. Y, who probably does 5 matters in a month, his knowledge of the IBC may be much, much better. And I can speak from my experience that, I feel that I think I've learned so much just reading in the last couple of days, despite the fact that I've been practicing for a while. And I'm not somebody who goes to the NCLT every day. I go to the NCLAT. I do a lot more, competition work than IBC work. I do a fair amount of IBC work. But if you were to ask me, therefore, am I an IBC practitioner? The answer is no. Am I a lawyer who deals with the IBC reasonably regularly? Yes. Do I know my way around the IBC? Yes. But the good thing about law, again, is you don't really need to know the law. You need to know where to find it. And you have to be able to find it within, a short amount of time. Our training gives us that ability. And as counsel, on a given day, you'll probably do more than one branch of law. So the challenge really is to grasp what's in the paper book, to pick out the law that applies, to be able to articulate it over a short period of time and try and get relief for your client, etc. In the process, you'll realize that you do some, an area of law reasonably long enough, things come naturally to you. So and that's why they say, in law, the more time you spend, the more your experience kind of helps you than anything else. And of course, it's good to have a good memory. You should be reading more often. So just to answer your question in 2 points, keep reading anything on the IBC. Number 2, look out for names that appear regularly. Obviously, do your homework. Get a sense of their reputations. Get a sense of how they are with their juniors and interns, and find that 1 or 2 offices or 3 offices where interns have come back feeling very happy because they've got a lot of responsibility. They've learned a lot watching. They've learned a lot interacting. And that's the best way to get into the framework. And once you get in, there's no getting out. Then you'll love it. So, and then of course, hopefully you'll be at a place where tomorrow somebody will want to intern with you, and please remember to be nice to them when they come to intern with you.
Right, sir. So I must say that with all your understanding, all your knowledge, you have very comprehensively covered this vast topic. And I am afraid that such a big act, such a large, having so many sections, how can it be covered in 1 hour? But you have covered in addition to the case law also. And we are very happy that we have the recent cases on the IPC law, so that the interested students can go through these cases cases, and definitely when we read latest cases, the Supreme Court has discussed, as you have mentioned in your PPT, that they have discussed the history of the law, from where it has originated, what is the development, and the important provisions have been discussed here in the case laws. So I am very happy that you have spared your time. You have given us so much time and opportunity to understand this recent development, which is very, very important for the students to understand in such a way. Thank you, Advocate Rao, and we will definitely in future also will contact you, and we would like to have you in more sessions to guide our students on different aspects. So
That'll be a pleasure, ma'am. It'll help us. In fact, like I said, every time I think we need to speak to somebody about the law, I think we go back and visit it, which we would not normally do. So thank you for giving us the ability to revisit this law.
So
and I must thank Samir again. But for him, I wouldn't have been able to put this presentation together. He's done a lot of work on this. So that's again the advantage. Just to that, to the person who asked me about how to get into the profession. The beauty of this profession is also about the bonds and relationships you build. So I keep joking that my office is like Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So poor Samir has gone independent, but is still tied to me whether he likes it or not. And just the way we are tied to our institutions. So thank you so much.
I'm very thankful to Samir. I'm very thankful to you. I say thank you on behalf of Law Center 1, our professor in charge, and on my personal behalf, thank you so much for giving this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.